Tommy Rodriguez never thought he'd find trouble in a quiet neighborhood like Pine Valley. After spending 3 years dodging bullets in Afghanistan, mowing his lawn on a peaceful Sunday morning should have been the easiest thing in the world. But life has a funny way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. The morning started like any other. Tommy woke up early, grabbed his coffee, and stepped outside to check on his small garden. The tomatoes were coming along nicely, and the peppers looked promising. He'd always found peace in growing things after spending so much time in places where nothing seemed to grow except trouble. Tommy had moved to Pine Valley 6 months ago, using his veteran benefits to buy a small house on Maple Street. It wasn't much to look at from the outside, but it was his. After years of sleeping in barracks and tents, having his own place felt like winning the lottery. The neighbors had been friendly enough when he moved in. Mrs. Chen from next door brought him cookies. Old Mr. Peterson across the street helped him fix his mailbox when it got knocked over during a storm. The house came with a decent-sized garage where Tommy kept his pride and joy, a 1967 Mustang that he'd been slowly bringing back to life. Most weekends you could find him under the hood, tinkering with the engine or carefully sanding down rust spots. It was therapeutic work that kept his hands busy and his mind focused on something positive. On this particular Sunday, Tommy decided to give the Mustang a good wash before working on the engine. He pulled on his comfortable desert camouflage pants, the same ones he'd worn during his service overseas. They were practical, durable, and had plenty of pockets for tools. More importantly, they felt familiar in a world that still sometimes felt foreign to him. Tommy had been adjusting to civilian life better than some of his buddies, but it wasn't always easy. The crowds at the grocery store could still make him nervous. Sudden loud noises made him jump, but here in his own garage, working with his hands on something he could control, he felt at peace. He was just starting to soap up the Mustang when he noticed someone watching him from across the street. At first, he didn't think much of it. Neighbors watched neighbors, that was normal. But this felt different, more intense, like he was being studied rather than just casually observed. The woman doing the watching was someone Tommy had seen around but never actually met. She looked to be in her 40s, always perfectly dressed even when she was just checking her mailbox. Her house was the kind of place that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Not a single blade of grass out of place, flowers arranged in perfect rows, and a driveway so clean you could probably eat off it. Tommy tried to ignore the feeling of being watched and focused on his car. He'd learned in the military that sometimes the best approach was to mind your own business and hope others would do the same. But as he worked, he could feel those eyes on him, tracking his every movement. After about 20 minutes, the watching stopped being passive. The woman marched across the street with purpose, her heels clicking against the pavement like a countdown timer. She carried herself like someone who was used to being in charge, someone who expected people to listen when she spoke. Tommy looked up from his car as she approached, automatically straightening up the way he'd been trained to do when a superior officer entered the room. "Old habits die hard." "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp and businesslike. "I'm Patricia Wellington, president of the Pine Valley Homeowners Association. We need to talk." Tommy wiped his hands on a rag and nodded politely. "Good morning, ma'am. I'm Tommy Rodriguez. Nice to finally meet you." Patricia didn't return his friendly greeting. Instead, she pulled out a folded stack of papers from her purse and held them up like evidence in a court case. "I'm here about your clothing choices, Mr. Rodriguez. Specifically those military pants you're wearing." Tommy looked down at his camo pants, confused. They were clean, in good condition, and certainly modest. "Is there a problem, ma'am?" "There most certainly is," Patricia replied, unfolding what appeared to be a printed document. "According to Section 4 of our community guidelines, residents must maintain appropriate attire when visible from public areas. Military camouflage creates an unprofessional appearance that could negatively impact property values." Tommy felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach. The same feeling he used to get when dealing with unreasonable people in positions of authority. "These are just work clothes, ma'am. I served in Afghanistan, and these are comfortable for doing projects around the house." Patricia's expression didn't soften. If anything, she seemed more annoyed by his explanation. "I don't care where you claim to have served, Mr. Rodriguez. What I care about is maintaining the standards of this community. You're not on a military base anymore. You're in a respectable neighborhood with families and professionals." The way she said, claimed to have served hit Tommy like a physical blow. He'd heard that tone before from people who questioned whether veterans like him had really seen combat, whether their service was legitimate, whether they deserved the respect they'd earned through sacrifice and dedication. "Ma'am, I can show you my discharge papers if you'd like," Tommy offered, trying to keep his voice steady. "These aren't a costume. They're part of my service gear and they're practical for work." Patricia waved her hand dismissively. "I'm not interested in your paperwork. What I'm interested in is compliance with community standards. You have until tomorrow evening to find appropriate civilian clothing for outdoor activities, or you'll be subject to daily fines starting at $50. Tommy felt his jaw tighten. $50 a day for wearing comfortable pants in his own driveway? It seemed insane, but he'd learned that some battles weren't worth fighting. And what exactly qualifies as appropriate civilian clothing? Khakis, jeans, shorts without patterns, or military associations? Patricia rattled off like she'd memorized a list. Basically, anything that doesn't make this neighborhood look like a military compound. The irony wasn't lost on Tommy. He'd spent years defending the very freedoms that Patricia was now trying to take away from him in his own home, but arguing with people like this rarely led anywhere productive. "I'll take that under consideration," Tommy said carefully, neither agreeing nor refusing outright. Patricia seemed to interpret this as agreement. "Good, I'm glad we understand each other. This is a family-friendly community, Mr. Rodriguez. We all need to do our part to maintain its character." As she turned to leave, Tommy couldn't help but ask, "Have there been any complaints from other neighbors about my clothing?" Patricia paused and looked back at him with a slight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Let's just say that concerned residents have brought certain issues to my attention. As HOA president, it's my job to address problems before they become bigger problems." After Patricia left, Tommy stood in his driveway feeling like he'd just been ambushed. The peaceful Sunday morning had turned into something that felt uncomfortably familiar, dealing with people who seemed to have nothing better to do than make life difficult for others. He thought about his neighbors, who had been nothing but kind to him. Mrs. Chen, who always asked how he was settling in. Mr. Peterson, who had invited him to a backyard barbecue last month. Had they really complained about his clothing? Or was this just Patricia's personal crusade? Tommy finished washing his car in silence, his mind racing through his options. He could comply with Patricia's demands and avoid conflict. He could ignore her threats and see what happened. Or he could try to find a middle ground that satisfied everyone. As he put away his cleaning supplies, Tommy realized this was probably just the beginning. People like Patricia rarely stopped with one victory. If she was willing to harass him over his choice of pants, what would be next? His car, his garden? The American flag he was thinking about hanging by his front door? For the first time since moving to Pine Valley, Tommy felt like he might have made a mistake. He'd thought he was moving to a place where he could live quietly and peacefully. Instead, it seemed like he'd stumbled into a different kind of battlefield, one where the rules were unclear, and the enemy wore designer clothes instead of uniforms. The next morning, Tommy woke up hoping that yesterday's confrontation with Patricia Wellington had been some kind of weird dream. But as he got dressed for another day of working on his car, reality set in. He stood in his closet looking at the same camo pants that had caused all the trouble, and felt frustrated by the whole situation. After thinking it over, Tommy decided to wear regular jeans. Not because he agreed with Patricia's demands, but because picking battles wasn't always worth the stress. He had bigger things to worry about than some uptight neighbor with too much time on her hands. But Patricia wasn't done with him. Not even close. Around noon, Tommy was under the hood of his Mustang when he heard the familiar click of heels on pavement. He didn't need to look up to know who was approaching. The footsteps had a particular rhythm that he was starting to recognize. Quick, determined, and slightly aggressive. "Mr. Rodriguez." Patricia's voice cut through the peaceful afternoon air. Tommy slid out from under the car and looked up at her. She was holding her phone this time, and something about her posture told him this visit was going to be different from yesterday's. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Wellington," Tommy said, wiping grease off his hands with a rag. "I see you took my advice about the clothing," she said, glancing at his jeans with what might have been approval. "But we have a new problem." Tommy felt his stomach drop. "What kind of problem?" Patricia held up her phone, showing him what appeared to be a photo. Your car is leaking oil onto the street. That's a violation of our environmental protection guidelines. Tommy looked at the spot where his car was parked. There was indeed a small dark stain on the asphalt, barely the size of a dinner plate. It was the kind of minor leak that most old cars developed over time. Hardly an environmental disaster. I can put some cardboard down to catch any drips, Tommy offered. It's just a small leak from the oil pan gasket. I'm planning to fix it this weekend. That's not sufficient, Patricia replied, tapping something on her phone. I'm documenting this violation for the HOA board. You have 48 hours to resolve the issue completely. Tommy felt his patience starting to wear thin. Mrs. Wellington, with respect, it's a tiny oil leak. Every parking lot in America has stains like this. This isn't every parking lot in America. Mr. Rodriguez, this is Pine Valley and we maintain higher standards here. As Patricia spoke, Mrs. Chen appeared in her front yard, clearly trying to tend to her flowers while keeping an ear on the conversation. When she caught Tommy's eye, she gave him a small, sympathetic wave. It was a tiny gesture, but it reminded Tommy that not everyone in the neighborhood shared Patricia's attitude. I'll take care of the oil leak, Tommy said, deciding once again that cooperation was easier than conflict. But Patricia wasn't finished. There's also the matter of your work schedule. Several residents have complained about noise during inappropriate hours. This caught Tommy off guard. Noise? I don't work on the car before 9 in the morning or after 6 in the evening. I specifically checked the community guidelines about that. The guidelines are minimums. Mr. Rodriguez, just because something is technically allowed doesn't mean it's considerate to your neighbors. Tommy felt a flash of anger, but kept his voice level. Can you tell me which neighbors complained? I'd be happy to talk to them directly and work out a schedule that works for everyone. Patricia's expression shifted slightly, and for a moment, Tommy thought he saw something that looked like discomfort. That's not how the HOA process works. Complaints are handled through official channels to protect residents' privacy. Something about her answer didn't sit right with Tommy. In his experience, people who had legitimate complaints were usually willing to have direct conversations about solutions. Anonymous complaints often came from people who weren't actually affected by the problem. Over the next few days, Patricia's visits became a regular occurrence. She complained about Tommy's mailbox being slightly crooked. She questioned whether his garden vegetables were aesthetically appropriate for front yard landscaping. She even suggested that his American flag was unnecessarily large and might be intimidating to some residents. Each complaint came with documentation, photos and references to various sections of the HOA guidelines that Tommy was pretty sure had been interpreted very creatively. It was becoming clear that Patricia had decided he was a problem that needed to be solved. Regardless of whether he was actually causing any real issues, the situation escalated significantly when Tommy's younger brother visited for the weekend. Danny Rodriguez was also a veteran, having served 2 tours in Iraq. He arrived Friday evening wearing a simple Army t-shirt and jeans, looking forward to helping Tommy work on the Mustang and catching up on family news. Saturday morning, the brothers were in the garage discussing engine timing when they heard car doors slamming outside. Through the open garage door, they could see Patricia talking animatedly to 2 police officers who had just arrived. Tommy and Danny exchanged glances. Both had enough experience with law enforcement to know that this probably wasn't a social visit. One of the officers, a middle-aged man with graying hair, approached the garage. His partner, a younger woman, hung back near their patrol car but kept an eye on the situation. "Good morning," the older officer said. "I'm Officer Peterson and this is Officer Martinez. We received a call about a disturbance in the neighborhood." Tommy felt his heart rate spike, but he kept his voice calm. "Good morning, officers. I'm Tommy Rodriguez and this is my brother Danny. We've just been working on my car. Is there a problem?" Officer Peterson looked around the garage, taking in the organized tools, the car parts neatly arranged on workbenches and the general atmosphere of a normal weekend project. "We got a call about suspicious individuals in military gear gathering in the neighborhood." The caller was concerned about potential illegal activity. Danny, who had been quiet until now, gestured to his t-shirt and laughed. "Military gear? This old thing. I got it at the base exchange for $12. Officer Peterson smiled slightly. "Mind if I ask about your service?" "Iraq 2018 to 2020, Danny replied. "Tommy here did Afghanistan. We're just working on his car and catching up." The tension in Officer Peterson's posture visibly relaxed. "Thank you for your service, both of you. Can I ask who made the complaint?" Tommy nodded toward Patricia, who was still standing by the patrol car, obviously expecting the officers to take some kind of dramatic action. "Mrs. Wellington, the HOA president. She's been having issues with various things about my property." Officer Peterson's expression grew more serious. "What kind of issues?" "Complaints about my clothing, my car, my work schedule, my garden, my flag," Tommy listed. "Pretty much everything I do seems to be a problem for her." The officer nodded thoughtfully. "Mr. Rodriguez, are you aware that wearing military clothing, working on your car in your own garage, and displaying an American flag are all completely legal activities?" "Yes, sir, I am." "And Mrs. Wellington knows you're a veteran?" "Yes, sir. I explained that when she first complained about my clothes." Officer Peterson walked over to where Patricia was waiting. Tommy couldn't hear the entire conversation, but he caught phrases like false report, wasting police, resources, and harassment. Patricia's voice got progressively louder and more indignant as the conversation continued. After about 10 minutes, Officer Peterson returned to the garage. "Mr. Rodriguez, I want you to know that you're not doing anything wrong. If Mrs. Wellington continues to make false reports about your activities, she could face charges for filing fraudulent police reports." "I appreciate that, officer. I'm just trying to live quietly and not cause problems for anyone." "You're not causing problems," Officer Peterson said firmly. "Some people just have too much time on their hands and not enough real problems to worry about." After the police left, Tommy and Danny went back to working on the car, but the mood had definitely changed. What had started as a relaxing family weekend had turned into something that felt uncomfortably familiar to both veterans, being treated like potential threats in their own country. "She's not going to stop. You know," Danny said as he handed Tommy a wrench. "I know," Tommy replied. "But what am I supposed to do? Move again? Let her run me out of my own neighborhood? Have you talked to any of the other neighbors about this?" Tommy shook his head. "I don't want to create drama or force people to pick sides. Maybe it's time to find out if you actually have any support here, or if you're fighting this battle alone." That evening, as Danny was getting ready to head back to his base, Mrs. Chen appeared at Tommy's front door with a casserole dish and a concerned expression. "Tommy, I hope you don't mind me saying, but what happened today with the police was ridiculous," she said. "My husband and I were watching from our window, and we couldn't believe that woman called the cops on you and your brother for working on a car." "It's okay, Mrs. Chen. I don't want to cause problems in the neighborhood." "You're not causing problems, honey, she is, and I'm not the only one who thinks so." Mrs. Chen's words gave Tommy hope that maybe he wasn't as alone in this situation as he'd thought, but they also made him realize that Patricia's campaign against him was affecting more than just his own peace of mind. It was creating tension throughout the neighborhood, forcing people to witness conflicts that nobody wanted to be part of. As he watched his brother drive away that evening, Tommy made a decision. He wasn't going to be bullied out of his home or forced to live in fear of his own HOA president, but he also wasn't going to escalate the situation unnecessarily. What he needed was information, support, and maybe some advice from people who understood both military service and civilian law. Because if Patricia Wellington wanted to play hardball, Tommy was going to make sure he knew the rules of the game. Monday morning found Tommy sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and his laptop, trying to figure out his next move. The incident with the police had been a wake-up call. Patricia Wellington wasn't just being difficult. She was actively trying to make his life miserable, and she was willing to involve law enforcement in her personal vendetta. Tommy had spent most of Sunday thinking about what Mrs. Chen had said. If other neighbors were noticing Patricia's behavior and finding it unreasonable, maybe he had more support than he realized. But he also knew that most people preferred to avoid conflict, even when they disagreed with what was happening. His first step was reaching out to his old unit's support network. The military had taught him that when facing a problem bigger than yourself, you don't go it alone. You find people who have the knowledge and resources to help. Tommy opened his laptop and logged into the veteran support forum that his unit used to stay in touch. Within minutes of posting about his situation, responses started coming in. Some guys shared similar stories about difficult neighbors and HOA problems. Others offered practical advice about tenant rights and local laws. But it was a message from Captain Lisa Chen, no relation to his neighbor Mrs. Chen, that really caught his attention. Captain Chen was a JAG officer, a military lawyer who specialized in helping veterans with civilian legal issues. Her message was direct and professional. Tommy, what you're describing sounds like potential discrimination against a protected veteran. Can you document everything that's happened? Dates, times, what was said, any witnesses? This could be more serious than just a neighborhood dispute. Tommy spent the next hour typing up a detailed timeline of everything that had happened since Patricia's first visit. As he wrote it all down, the pattern became even clearer. Patricia hadn't started with random complaints about property maintenance. She'd started specifically with his military clothing and had escalated from there. By Tuesday, Tommy had gathered enough documentation to feel confident about his next step. Captain Chen had connected him with a local veterans' rights organization, and they'd scheduled a phone consultation for that afternoon. Meanwhile, Patricia seemed to be ramping up her campaign. Tommy noticed her standing at her front window more often, obviously watching his house. She'd also started leaving printed copies of HOA violations taped to his front door, even for things that weren't actually violations. The breaking point came Wednesday evening when Tommy was watering his garden. Patricia appeared at his property line with her phone out, recording him. "Mrs. Wellington, what are you doing?" Tommy asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "Documenting your water usage," she replied matter-of-factly. "There are restrictions on lawn watering, and I want to make sure you're in compliance." Tommy looked at the small watering can in his hand, then at his modest vegetable garden. "This is drinking water for my tomato plants. I'm not irrigating a golf course." "Excessive water usage is excessive water usage," Patricia said, still recording. "The environmental impact doesn't change based on what you claim you're watering." That evening, Tommy called his brother Danny to update him on the situation. Danny listened to the whole story, getting progressively more angry as Tommy described Patricia's escalating behavior. "She's documenting everything you do with her phone now?" Danny asked. "Pretty much. It's like living under surveillance." "Tommy, this isn't normal neighbor behavior. This woman has a serious problem with you, and it's not about HOA rules." "I know. That's why I've been talking to Captain Chen and the Veterans Organization. They think I might have grounds for a discrimination complaint." "Good. Because what she's doing isn't just annoying, it's harassment." Thursday brought a new development that changed everything. Tommy was checking his mail when Mr. Peterson from across the street walked over with a concerned expression. "Tommy, I hope you don't mind me asking, but is everything okay with you and the HOA?" "It's been a bit challenging," Tommy replied carefully. "Mrs. Wellington has had some concerns about various things." Mr. Peterson shook his head. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 15 years and I've never seen anything like what's been happening. She's been going door to door trying to get people to sign some kind of petition about you." Tommy felt his stomach drop. "A petition?" "Something about community standards and property values. My wife and I refused to sign it. And so did most of the people I've talked to. But I thought you should know what she's doing." "What exactly is she telling people?" "She's claiming you're some kind of security risk because of your military background. She's saying that having veterans in the neighborhood might attract the wrong element and make families feel unsafe." Tommy felt anger rising in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Mr. Peterson, I appreciate you telling me this. Can I ask what your honest opinion is about me as a neighbor?" "Tommy, you're one of the best neighbors we've had on this street. You're quiet, you keep your property neat, and you've been nothing but polite to everyone. My grandson loves watching you work on that old Mustang. What Patricia is doing isn't right, and a lot of us are getting pretty tired of it." That conversation gave Tommy the final push he needed to take more decisive action. That evening he called Captain Chen and told her about Patricia's door-to-door campaign. "Tommy, this is exactly the kind of evidence we need," Captain Chen said. "She's creating a hostile environment based specifically on your veteran status. That's not just harassment, it's potentially illegal discrimination under federal law." "What are my options?" "Well, we can start with a formal complaint to the local housing authority. We can also contact the state attorney general's office, since HOA discrimination is something they take seriously. But I think the most effective approach might be to demonstrate community support." "What do you mean?" "If Patricia is trying to turn the neighborhood against you by claiming you're a threat, we should show that the opposite is true. The military community has ways of demonstrating support that tend to be very effective at changing people's perspectives. Friday morning, Tommy woke up to find another note taped to his door. This one was different from Patricia's usual violation notices. It was printed on official HOA letterhead and announced a special community meeting for the following Saturday to discuss security concerns and community standards. The meeting was clearly about him, though his name wasn't mentioned directly. The notice talked about recent issues and the need to address behaviors that may impact property, values, and family safety. Tommy immediately called Captain Chen to tell her about the meeting. Perfect, she said. That's exactly what we need. She's creating a public forum to air her complaints about you. That gives us the opportunity to respond publicly too. What do you mean? Tommy, how would you feel about having some support at that meeting? I've been talking to some people, and there's a lot of interest in showing that the veteran community takes care of its own. What kind of support? Let me make some calls and get back to you. But I think Saturday's meeting is going to be very interesting. That evening, Mrs. Chen knocked on Tommy's door again, this time with her husband and several other neighbors that Tommy recognized but hadn't met formally. Tommy, we heard about the meeting on Saturday, Mrs. Chen said. We wanted you to know that not everyone in this neighborhood agrees with what Patricia is doing. We think she's completely out of line, added Mr. Peterson, who had apparently organized this impromptu gathering. Most of us didn't even know there were problems until she started going door to door with that ridiculous petition. Another neighbor, a woman named Janet who lived 2 streets over, spoke up. My son is deployed overseas right now. The idea that we should treat veterans like threats in our own neighborhood is disgusting to me. What Patricia doesn't understand, said Mr. Chen, is that this kind of behavior makes the whole neighborhood look bad. We're supposed to be a community, not a place where people get harassed for serving their country. Tommy felt a wave of relief wash over him. For weeks he'd been feeling isolated and unsure whether his neighbors supported him or just didn't want to get involved. Now he was learning that most of them had been quietly disagreeing with Patricia's behavior all along. I appreciate all of you coming by, Tommy said. I've been trying to handle this situation quietly, but it's gotten to the point where I think Saturday's meeting is going to be important. We'll be there, Mr. Peterson assured him. And we'll make sure Patricia knows that her opinions don't represent this neighborhood. After his neighbors left, Tommy sat on his front porch and looked around the quiet streets of Pine Valley. 6 months ago, this had seemed like the perfect place to start over and build a peaceful civilian life. Patricia Wellington had tried to turn it into a battlefield, but maybe she'd made a mistake. Maybe she'd picked a fight with the wrong veteran in the wrong neighborhood at the wrong time. And maybe Saturday's meeting was going to teach her that the military community has ways of dealing with bullies that she hadn't considered. Tommy pulled out his phone and called Captain Chen back. Captain, about that support you mentioned for Saturday's meeting. I think I'd like to hear more about what you have in mind. Friday evening, Tommy's phone rang just as he was finishing dinner. The caller ID showed Captain Chen's number, and when he answered, her voice carried an energy that he hadn't heard before. Tommy, I've got some news about tomorrow's meeting that I think you're going to like. I'm listening. I've been making calls all week, and word about your situation has spread further than I expected. It turns out that Colonel James Mitchell from Fort Harrison heard about what's been happening. Tommy nearly dropped his phone. Colonel Mitchell had been his commanding officer in Afghanistan, a man who commanded respect from everyone who served under him. The idea that his old CO knew about his neighborhood troubles was both embarrassing and oddly comforting. Colonel Mitchell remembers you well, Captain Chen continued. He's not happy about how you're being treated. In fact, he's decided that tomorrow would be a perfect opportunity for what he's calling a community outreach exercise. What kind of community outreach exercise? The kind where Fort Harrison demonstrates its appreciation for veterans and shows the local community how much the military values the service of people like you. Tommy felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. Military demonstrations of support could be impressive, but they could also be overwhelming for civilian neighborhoods. Captain, I don't want to cause more problems or make Patricia feel like she's being intimidated. Tommy, intimidation isn't the goal here. Education is. Patricia Wellington has been spreading the idea that veterans are somehow threatening to neighborhood safety. Colonel Mitchell thinks it's time to show what veterans actually represent. How many people are we talking about? Well, that's still being organized. But I can tell you that the word has gone out through several veteran networks and the response has been enthusiastic. Saturday morning arrived with perfect weather. Tommy woke up early and made coffee, trying to calm his nerves about whatever was going to happen at the HOA meeting. He'd been to plenty of military briefings and community meetings during his service, but this felt different. This was personal. Around 8 o'clock, Tommy noticed the first sign that today was going to be unusual. A pickup truck with veteran license plates pulled up across the street, and 2 men in their 50s got out. They were wearing matching shirts that said Afghanistan Veterans Association, and they nodded politely to Tommy before walking toward the community center. 15 minutes later, another car arrived. Then another. By 9 o'clock, Tommy counted at least 20 vehicles parked along the streets near the community center, many of them displaying military base stickers, veteran organization decals, or license plates that identified their owners as former or current service members. Tommy's doorbell rang, and when he opened it, he found Captain Chen standing on his porch in full dress uniform. Behind her were 3 other people, a woman in army dress blues and 2 men in what appeared to be dress uniforms from different branches of service. "Good morning, Tommy," Captain Chen said with a smile. "I'd like you to meet some colleagues who wanted to be here today. The introductions were impressive. Major Helen Foster from the Army JAG, Corps Senior Chief Petty Officer Robert Kim from the Navy, Master Sergeant David Reyes from the Air Force. All of them had heard about Tommy's situation through military networks and had volunteered their Saturday morning to show support. "We're not here to cause trouble," Major Foster explained. "We're here to educate the community about what veterans actually contribute to neighborhoods like this one." At exactly 10 o'clock, the group walked toward the community center. Tommy was amazed to see the number of people gathering outside the building. He recognized some faces from the veteran support forums he'd been visiting online. Others were complete strangers who had apparently heard about the meeting through word of mouth, but it wasn't just veterans. Mrs. Chen was there with her husband and several other neighbors that Tommy recognized. Mr. Peterson had brought what appeared to be his entire extended family. Janet, the neighbor whose son was deployed overseas, had a group of women with her who were wearing shirts that said Military Moms. The community center, which normally hosted maybe 20 people for HOA meetings, was packed with over 60 people. Patricia Wellington stood at the front of the room looking like she'd expected a very different kind of gathering. Colonel Mitchell entered the room at exactly 10:15, and even people who didn't recognize him could tell he was someone important. He carried himself with the kind of quiet authority that comes from years of leading people in difficult situations. Patricia called the meeting to order and began with what was clearly a prepared speech about community standards and property values. She spoke about the need to maintain appropriate behaviors and ensure that Pine Valley remained family-friendly and welcoming to all residents. Then she got to the real purpose of the meeting. "We're here today to address concerns about activities and behaviors that may be impacting our community's character," Patricia said, looking directly at Tommy. "While we respect everyone's background, we need to ensure that all residents understand their responsibilities to maintain neighborhood standards." She pulled out a folder and began reading what sounded like a formal complaint. Excessive noise, inappropriate clothing, environmental violations, public disturbances. The list went on, making Tommy sound like a one-man wrecking crew who had somehow destroyed the peace and tranquility of Pine Valley. When Patricia finished her presentation, she looked around the room with obvious satisfaction. "Are there any questions or comments about these concerns?" Colonel Mitchell stood up slowly. "Ma'am, I have a few comments, if I may." Patricia nodded, apparently assuming she was about to receive support from someone in a position of authority. "My name is Colonel James Mitchell, and I'm the commanding officer of the 3rd Special Forces Group at Fort Harrison." The colonel began in a voice that carried easily to every corner of the room. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez served under my command in Afghanistan, where he distinguished himself in combat operations against enemy forces." The room fell completely silent. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez participated in over 40 combat missions, during which he saved the lives of multiple fellow soldiers and Afghan civilians. He was awarded the Bronze Star for Valor and the Purple Heart for wounds received in action. Patricia's confident expression was starting to falter. The concerns that have been raised today about Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's character and his impact on this community are not only baseless, they're insulting to everyone who has worn the uniform of the United States military. Colonel Mitchell paused and looked around the room. But I'm not here just to defend one soldier. I'm here to educate this community about what veterans actually bring to neighborhoods like this one. What followed was the most compelling presentation about veteran contributions that Tommy had ever heard. Colonel Mitchell talked about leadership, service, and the values that military training instills in people. He spoke about veterans' lower crime rates, their community involvement, and their economic contributions. Veterans don't make neighborhoods less safe, Colonel Mitchell concluded. They make them safer. They don't decrease property values. They increase them through their commitment to community improvement and civic responsibility. When the colonel finished speaking, Captain Chen stood up to address the legal aspects of Patricia's campaign. What we've seen here isn't just a neighborhood dispute, Captain Chen explained. Targeting someone for harassment based on their veteran status is a form of discrimination that violates both federal and state fair housing laws. She pulled out a folder of her own. The documentation we've gathered shows a clear pattern of behavior that goes well beyond normal HOA enforcement. Filing false police reports, attempting to organize neighborhood opposition based on military service, and creating a hostile living environment are all serious legal issues. Patricia tried to interrupt, but Captain Chen continued. The Department of Veterans Affairs has been notified of this situation, and several veteran advocacy organizations are monitoring the outcome of today's meeting. After Captain Chen finished, Mr. Peterson stood up to speak for the neighborhood residents. I've lived on Maple Street for 15 years, he said, and I can tell you that Tommy Rodriguez has been one of the best neighbors we've ever had. He's quiet, respectful, and helpful. The problems we've been hearing about today aren't problems that any of us have experienced. Other neighbors stood up to share similar sentiments. Mrs. Chen talked about how safe she felt, knowing that someone with Tommy's background lived next door. Janet spoke about her pride in having a combat veteran in the neighborhood, while her own son was serving overseas. By the time the neighbors finished speaking, it was clear that Patricia had completely misjudged the community's attitude toward Tommy and veterans in general. Patricia tried to regain control of the meeting, but her argument sounded weak and petty compared to what everyone had just heard. She complained about military intimidation and suggested that the large turnout was somehow proof that veterans were a disruptive influence. Colonel Mitchell stood up one more time. Ma'am, if you see a room full of people who have served their country as intimidating, that says more about your perspective than it does about them. The meeting ended with a unanimous vote by the HOA board to rescind all pending violations against Tommy and to issue a formal apology for any misunderstanding about community standards. As people filed out of the community center, Tommy found himself surrounded by veterans, neighbors, and new friends who wanted to congratulate him and offer continued support. But the most meaningful moment came when Patricia Wellington approached him near the parking lot. She looked exhausted and defeated, but also somehow relieved. Mr. Rodriguez, she said quietly, I owe you an apology. I think I got carried away with things that didn't really matter. Tommy looked at her for a moment, remembering all the stress and frustration she'd caused him over the past few weeks. But he also remembered what the military had taught him about dealing with defeated enemies. Mrs. Wellington, we all make mistakes. What matters is how we move forward from here. She nodded and walked away, and Tommy never had another problem with the HOA again. The weeks following the community center meeting brought changes to Pine Valley that nobody could have predicted. What had started as one neighbor's complaint about camouflage, pants had somehow transformed into something much bigger and more positive than anyone expected. Tommy's first indication that things were different came Monday morning when he stepped outside to check his mail. Mr. Peterson was working in his garden and called out a cheerful, "Good morning." Mrs. Chen waved from her kitchen window. Janet drove by on her way to work and honked her horn in a friendly greeting. But the biggest surprise was the note he found taped to his front door. Unlike Patricia's previous violations and complaints, this one was handwritten and bore the official HOA letterhead. Mr. Rodriguez, it read, the Pine Valley HOA Board would like to formally invite you to serve as our new Community Relations Coordinator. We believe your leadership experience and commitment to service would be valuable assets to our neighborhood. Please contact us at your convenience to discuss this opportunity. The note was signed by all 5 board members, including Patricia Wellington. Tommy stared at the note for a long moment, trying to process this unexpected turn of events. Just 2 weeks ago, these same people had been listening to complaints about his clothing choices and noise levels. Now they wanted him to help lead the community. When he called the number on the note, he spoke with Mrs. Henderson, the board secretary, who explained that Saturday's meeting had been a wake-up call for the entire HOA leadership. We realized that we'd been so focused on minor rule enforcement that we'd lost sight of what actually makes a community strong, she explained. Your military background and the way you handled this whole situation with such grace showed us the kind of leadership we need. The community relations coordinator position, as it turned out, involved working with new residents, organizing neighborhood events, and serving as a liaison between the HOA and local organizations. It was part-time, voluntary work, but it came with a small budget and the authority to implement programs that would benefit the entire neighborhood. Tommy's first project was organizing a community appreciation day for the following month. The idea was to bring neighbors together for food, games, and a chance to get to know each other better. But as word spread about the event, it grew into something much larger. Colonel Mitchell called to let Tommy know that Fort Harrison would like to participate by providing a static display of military vehicles and equipment. The local VFW offered to run a barbecue booth. The fire department wanted to bring a truck for kids to explore. Even the police department, impressed by Officer Peterson's report about the incident with Patricia, volunteered to provide community safety demonstrations. 3 weeks later, Pine Valley hosted its first annual Community Day, and over 300 people showed up. The event featured everything from face painting and bounce houses to military vehicle displays and veteran recognition ceremonies. But the most popular attraction was Tommy's classic Mustang, which he'd finally finished restoring. Kids lined up to sit in the driver's seat, while their parents asked questions about the restoration process. The car that had once been a source of HOA complaints became a neighborhood treasure that everyone wanted to see and learn about. Patricia Wellington attended the event, though she kept a low profile and seemed genuinely surprised by the positive atmosphere. At one point, Tommy saw her talking to Mrs. Chen by the veteran recognition display, looking at photos of neighborhood residents who had served in various conflicts over the decades. Later that afternoon, Patricia approached Tommy while he was cleaning up after the car display. "Mr. Rodriguez, I wanted to apologize again for everything that happened," she said. "I think I was so worried about property values and rules that I forgot what actually makes a neighborhood valuable." "Mrs. Wellington, we all learned something from this situation," Tommy replied. "I learned that I have better neighbors than I realized, and maybe you learned that veterans aren't the problem I think you thought we were." Patricia smiled, the first genuine smile Tommy had ever seen from her. "I learned that I was the problem, and I want you to know that I've submitted my resignation as HOA president. Mrs. Henderson is taking over, and I think she'll do a much better job than I did." "Where will you go?" "I'm not going anywhere. This is my home too. But I think I need to focus on being a better neighbor instead of trying to control everyone else's behavior." The months that followed brought even more positive changes to Pine Valley. Tommy's community relations work led to partnerships with local veteran organizations, monthly neighborhood barbecues, and a community garden where residents could grow vegetables together. The veteran community's response to Tommy's situation had also created lasting connections. Several former military families moved to Pine Valley after hearing about the supportive neighborhood atmosphere. A veteran-owned landscaping company started providing services to residents at discounted rates. The local American Legion post began holding meetings in the community center. Danny Rodriguez visited more frequently, often bringing other veteran friends who enjoyed the welcoming atmosphere and the chance to work on classic cars in Tommy's garage. What had once been seen as suspicious military activity became an informal veteran social club that neighbors enjoyed watching and occasionally joining. Mrs. Chen started a tradition of bringing cookies to the garage sessions, and Mr. Peterson became an honorary member after demonstrating an unexpected knowledge of 1960s muscle cars. Even Patricia Wellington occasionally stopped by to ask questions about gardening, having discovered that Tommy's vegetable expertise extended well beyond the backyard. 6 months after the community center meeting, Tommy received a visit from Captain Chen, who had been monitoring the situation as part of her work with veteran advocacy groups. "Tommy, I wanted to let you know that your case has become something of a model for how communities can address veteran discrimination," she said. "We've had inquiries from HOAs and veteran organizations around the country who want to learn from what happened here." "What do you mean?" "Well, the way Colonel Mitchell and the Fort Harrison community responded, combined with your neighbor's support and the positive outcome, has shown that these situations don't have to end in lawsuits and bitter conflicts. Sometimes education and community involvement work better than legal action." Captain Chen pulled out a folder. "The Department of Veterans Affairs wants to use Pine Valley as a case study for a new program they're developing. They'd like to create a guide for helping communities understand veteran issues and prevent discrimination before it becomes a problem." The idea of his neighborhood troubles becoming a national model for veteran community relations was both humbling and exciting for Tommy, but what mattered most to him was that Pine Valley had become the peaceful, welcoming place he'd hoped for when he first moved to Maple Street. 1 year later, Tommy stood in his driveway washing the Mustang and wearing his comfortable camo pants. The car gleamed in the afternoon sun, and his vegetable garden was producing enough tomatoes and peppers to share with half the neighborhood. Mrs. Chen was working in her flower bed, occasionally asking advice about dealing with aphids. Mr. Peterson was teaching his grandson how to change a tire using Tommy's tools and expertise. Janet had just returned from visiting her son, who was finally home from his deployment and planning to move to Pine Valley himself. Patricia Wellington walked by with her dog, a rescue animal she'd adopted after deciding that being a good neighbor meant contributing to the community rather than controlling it. She stopped to admire the Mustang's paint job and mentioned that she was thinking about learning to garden herself. As Tommy put away his car washing supplies, he reflected on how much his life had changed since that first confrontation over his clothing choices. What had seemed like a simple neighborhood dispute had revealed the power of community, the importance of standing up for what's right, and the difference that military service can make in civilian life. The evening news was probably covering some conflict somewhere in the world. Politicians were likely arguing about veteran benefits, and people in other neighborhoods might be facing their own struggles with discrimination and misunderstanding. But in Pine Valley, on Maple Street, peace had been achieved through the simplest and most powerful force of all: people choosing to treat each other with respect, understanding, and genuine care. Tommy folded his American flag for the evening, the same flag that Patricia had once complained was too large and intimidating. Now it flew proudly over a neighborhood that had learned the difference between blind rule-following and true community values. As he headed inside to start dinner, Tommy could hear the sound of kids playing in the street, neighbors talking over garden fences, and the peaceful quiet of a place where everyone felt safe and welcome. It was exactly the kind of place worth serving to protect.